Xander made his way back to the inn on foot. The streets were quiet, and it was only occasionally that he would pass anyone on the street. He simply meandered his way to his destination, taking time to take in the city through the lens of night. The lights and fireplaces still lit in a few buildings bled out onto the street through windows, providing small patches of cozy, warm light here and there as he walked. Nothing exciting happened. No one tried to kill him, and he wasn't required to fight anything. It was quite relaxing to be able to just walk and think. The thing that was on his mind at the moment were his feelings toward Valteria. He was uncomfortable with the fact that he was feeling something at all. He mulled over the thought of whether it was moral for him to feel that way. Was it? He hadn't acted on it at all, so there was that. But was it wrong to even feel that way? He was a theoretically married man. Which brought up another question. Was he still married? He still thought of himself as married. But in reality, he wasn't. He'd lost his wedding ring, and he'd been gone from Earth, assuming that time flowed the same way here as it did in Earth for over 3 years. He wouldn't blame Helen for moving on if he found out that she had. He wasn't sure he was over it yet, though. He'd only been aware for less than half his total time in Talania. He'd settled well enough to many aspects of this new world, but he still caught himself thinking of Earth as back home, like he was ever going to go back, like he'd get to go back to Helen. He knew that there was a slim to zero chance of that ever happening, though. That, in all likelihood, life as he knew it here would become his normal. That one day, maybe, he might find someone else. But would it be wrong to date? Or perhaps court would be a better word in this world, with the unresolved hang-ups he had right now. He wasn't sure. So he decided on the easiest answer, to do nothing about his attraction, leave his own thought line unresolved, and wait to cross that bridge when someone actually expressed interest in him. Besides, he was approaching the inn now anyway. Shelving his thoughts for now, Xander stepped into the inn. The inside of the first floor was dimly lit by a sputtering fire on one end, and only a few patrons sat at any tables, huddled together having quiet conversations. The bartender had long since retired, and Xander barely earned a glance from the preoccupied patrons as he softly walked to the stairs and began to climb them. Xander quietly opened the door to his shared room and slipped inside, managing not to wake Gabell. Instead of carefully lying down on the bed, he opted to sit down on a chair. He didn't feel like just laying there with nothing but his thoughts. Instead, he'd rather occupy himself with a project, deciding to try a pass at his idea for the adaptive camouflage cloak. He'd start with just a small square, and he expected that it would end up more as practice with applying runes to cloth than anything. Creating a square of white cloth, he began using his abilities to weave threads of silver into the fabric. Gathering arrays and intelligence runes for power and to sense the color what was nearby, tied to another array, two of intelligence runes to exclude the wearer, were followed by more intelligence runes connected inverse light runes. The weaving took him several hours, the process being quite tedious. Xander didn't mind, though. The detailed work kept his mind occupied and away from the lurking thoughts of how he should handle personal relationships. Once the sequences of runes and arrays were complete, he took a closer look at the fabric, on which the runes had begun to take effect. He placed the cloth on the floor to observe the effects of the runes. It was only a partial success. While the rune work did recognize the area around it, Xander could clearly see the continuation of the wooden boards and even some of the darker sections of the wood grain. The color was completely off. Instead of blending in with the wood, the square of cloth ended up highlighting itself in a bright purple. Xander shrugged to himself, allowing himself a quiet sigh. It was a start. Perhaps he should divide the sensing runes into sets of 3, one for each color of light, to match the sets of 3 that the inverse light runes were set into. It might simplify the process. Deciding to try it out, he slowly began unraveling the runes woven into the square of fabric so that he could start over. He wasn't sure why he was unraveling them. He could have just set the whole thing aside to dissolve in a day and created a new blank square. But it felt wrong for some reason, like a waste, maybe a holdover from the days when he couldn't just create things at will, he supposed. When Gabell awoke, she found Xander still sitting in the same chair and still fiddling with the runes he'd woven into the piece of cloth. "Xander?" she asked, mildly startled to see a figure outside the bed. "What are you doing over there?" Xander said, broken from his focus on the cloth. "Oh, I was working on a project to keep myself occupied. I was, feeling a little restless when I came back last night." "Oh, okay, that's fine," Gabell said, nodding understandingly. "So, how'd your date go?" "It was not a date," Xander exclaimed. "But yeah, it went well. She wanted my input on her suit, and we ended up hammering out a little business agreement where she's going to teach me some of the more arcane fields of machinery here on this world, and I'll do some rune work for her." "Mmph," Gabell grunted as she sat up and stretched. "Well, that's good, I suppose. Not much else to do while we wait for those eggs." What am I gonna do for another whole month?" she lamented. Xander shrugged. "I don't know. Isn't there anything you want to work on? Some kind of skill you'd like to pick up or a goal you want to achieve?" "Well, I'd like to have a little garden of herbs I commonly use. But that's not exactly conducive to the life of a traveling mercenary." I'm not really sure. I've been living the life of a mercenary and enjoying it ever since we met, and it's occupied most of my time. I really just don't know what to do with myself with all this free time." "Well, you could always learn to cook so that Graphus isn't the one that's preparing whatever we catch out on the road," Xander said with a chuckle. Or you could read up on anatomy at the library. It could help you understand what your healing is doing more deeply. Of course, that's assuming you don't already. Maybe you do. Reading up on the anatomy of monsters or creatures or whatever the hell could help you fight them better, too." "That's true. I've always wondered if I could use my healing abilities in any way during a fight. Maybe that's something I could research. If nothing else, you're right that reading up on the anatomy of things I might fight would help me know where to hit. Blah, it beats sitting around here all day." "That's the spirit. I'll leave you to get dressed. I finally managed to get brown to actually look brown, so now I need to start testing with other colors." Xander gestured proudly at the small square of cloth he was holding in one hand as it shifted colors slightly from being waved about. That's good, I assume?" Gabell said, a little unsure as to what Xander was talking about. But yes, I should get dressed. I'll see you later. I'll be visiting Valteria's shop again today to do some work and hopefully learn some magic. Machine stuff. Yeah, that. Valteria had asked him to stop by late morning at the earliest, so he had a couple of hours before he needed to head that direction. In the meantime, he wanted to see how well his little square of cloth managed to duplicate colors other than the floor of his room at the inn. He spent the next 2 hours wandering about the common area of the inn, and then the outside of the inn, placing the fabric over various objects to test the color. It performed well with darker colors, but as he found brighter colors outdoors, he found that the runic arrays still struggled. They were too bright, enhancing the vibrancy of the object they were supposed to be mimicking. Xander scribbled down some notes on a pad he pulled from his inventory, jotting down the objects and colors that the arrays were still struggling with. Checking his watch, he sighed. He wouldn't have time to sit down and adjust the arrays until later because he needed to head over to Valteria's. As it was, he needed to begin heading there if he didn't want to miss his target time of late morning, which he'd guesstimated to be approximately 10:30. As he walked from behind the inn, he spied the stable, and a thought sparked in his mind. He hadn't spent as much time with Freya as he should have lately. He was sure the cat would enjoy a jaunt out through the city and to meet a new person. He made a stop by the stable and let Freya out of her stall, the big cat happily gallivanting out of her stall, excited to see Xander. "Hey, Freya," Xander said. "Sorry I haven't been spending much time with you," he told the cat a little guiltily. "Guess I've been a little distracted, what with the tournament and making a body." Freya grumbled at him but didn't stop rubbing her head against Xander's chest. "How about you come out with me today? I've got to go out, and I think you could use a walk. You can meet Valteria. She's supposed to be teaching me about arcane machinery. Just make sure you behave yourself in her shop and don't break anything, okay?" Freya huffed at Xander like she'd never once broken anything in her life and was not capable of exerting extreme force or of extreme violence. Xander and Freya began their journey from the inn to Valteria's shop. Xander took the thoroughfare that led past the guild, Freya happily following along, content to absorb the sights, sounds, and scents of the road as they strolled. Now that Xander wasn't confined to a suit of black plate armor, Freyja was the one who drew strangers' eyes the most, though the cat had grown used to being stared at by this point. Soon enough, they were at the door of Valteria's Mechanics and Sundries. Xander opened the door, letting himself and Freyja into the shop. As he entered, he spied Jarrett and Valteria both at work on the shop floor. Jarrett seemed to fitting a trigger to a crossbow, while Valteria's work was obscured by her body from Xander's vision. They both looked up as the door opened and then closed. "Xander? Hello there! Why do you have a giant cat?" Valteria asked in shock. "That is a very large cat," Jarrett said, sounding very unsure of the situation. "Hi," Xander said with a wave. "Ah, this is Freya. She's my bonded companion. Don't worry, she's very well behaved. I promise she won't break anything. And if she does, I'll pay for it, I suppose. You promise to be good, don't you, Freya?" Freya nodded her head enthusiastically to Valteria and Jarrett's surprise. "So," Xander said, tactfully ignoring the unsurety of Valteria and Jarrett around a large predator, "what's on the schedule for today?" Valteria shook her head slightly, clearing her distracted thoughts from her mind. Well, I suppose first off we should sit down and talk about some of the ideas I have for your rune work. You can tell me what is and isn't feasible, and then we can talk about what areas you want to focus on learning some of my tinkering knowledge." Xander nodded. "That sounds good. Where do you want to sit down and have this talk?" "Pull up a chair to my bench here. I've got a couple of things that I'm prototyping for these ideas." Xander moved over to an unused work table and carried the stool back over to Valteria's current work area and sat down. On the workbench in front of her were multiple miscellaneous cogs, gears, and other metal pieces that Xander was unable to identify. Valteria picked up a small cog and held it up. "Something simple first. Could you make a cog that turns on its own at a constant rate?" Xander cocked his head at such an easy request. Sure, that's not a problem at all, but what for?" Valteria's face lit up with the excitement that comes with getting to explain one's relatively niche interest to someone. "I could make a clock that never needs to be wound, with a runed cog providing power to the winding mechanism. I could make a clock that, with proper care and maintenance, would last centuries without once needing to be wound. That kind of thing can bring in quite the amount of coin from nobles and other luxury goods buyers." "Huh, I never really thought about that," Xander said. "Also," Valteria continued, "it has an application on just about any other clockwork device you could think of. I haven't done much with constructing clockwork automatons. I don't much care for things that need to be wound up before being set to a short, simple task, but with this, I could make something that would last even longer." Xander perked up a bit more when Valteria mentioned clockwork automatons. He thought back to the small clockwork spider he'd created as the first test of his automaton ability. "Interesting. What kind of automatons would you create?" Valteria answered immediately, clearly having thought on the matter already. "First, I think I'd like to make something that could assist me in combat, something that I could deploy from my armor that would help me deal with anything that gets in past my guard. Maybe also something to fold my laundry," she added with a small laugh. "But for something that could deal with the intricacies of combat, I'll need to get my hands on some kind of motive force," she added. "I'll need to get with a ritualist at some point and price something like a bound spirit that I can emplace to control the whole apparatus." Xander nodded in agreement. "That sounds like a smart idea. I had no idea that bound spirits were a thing, let alone that you could bind them to a clockwork body to make an automaton, so I'm learning already." Looking at the violet woman in front of him, he remembered something. "Hey, I hope that I don't come across as rude at all, but where are you from? I've never met someone that's, well, any shade of purple, and I'm curious about it." Valteria's smile from the excitement of thinking about clockwork fell slightly. Xander wasn't sure if he had come across as rude or if the question had reminded her of something unpleasant, but he felt a bit guilty either way. "No, I don't find it rude," she started off. "The curiosity is natural, of course. I'm from the other continent across the sea, Varden. I'm a Pix. We're distantly-ish? Related to elves, though I'll admit I'm not sure how. Just that that's what I grew up being told." Xander nodded along. Atrax had been right after all. Well, I'm going to get too nosy and start asking you why you came all this way to the other side of Talania. I'm sure you had your reasons. Unless you killed someone and fled to escape the law. Then I'd like to know. Valteria's smile returned as she chuckled at Xander's postulation. Nothing so dramatic, she said. I just didn't get along with my family and wanted a new start is all. Ah, I see. I hope I didn't bring back any unpleasant memories for you, Xander said, trailing off and feeling a little bit lame that he didn't have anything better to say in response. Oh, no, don't worry. I've had decades to brood over it, and I'll have centuries to continue doing so on and off whenever I'm feeling pensive. No harm done. But since I've indulged you, I hope you'll indulge me as well. You mentioned that you're a godsmarked, if I remember correctly. I might be far from home, but you are from a whole different plane of existence. What was your life like? How was that completely different world? Xander smiled wanly, and it was Valteria's turn to feel a twinge of guilt from their curiosity. What was life like? Well, it was different, but in all the ways that matter, kind of the same. The average person would get up and go to work to get paid and then go home. That's what I did for years. Wake up, go to work, come home to my wife. Really, I'd get home before her because she worked later than me most days, have dinner, hang out at home, or run any errands we needed to, and then repeat. The biggest difference was that there was no magic, no monsters, no elves or dwarves or picks, just us humans and technology. Compared to here, there were incredibly advanced things, and yet at the same time, there are things here that would be impossible back on Earth. I can show you some photos. It's like a painting, if you'd like. You had a wife, and the gods just took you from her. And your family, too, now that I think of it. That just seems, well, cruel is one way to put it. Yeah, I was married. No kids, but we'd planned on having some before. Xander waved generally to the area around him. All this happened. I'll admit I was bitter about it. Am bitter about it. I'm still working through a lot of things and feelings, I know that much. But all things considered, I'm learning to accept what happened. My life is certainly a lot more exciting, filled with travel and exotic places and people than it ever was before, so it's not all bad. I see. You know, I think I know someone, a couple someones actually, that you'd like to meet. There's a tavern in town I'd like to take you after we're done for the day here. It's called The Other Side. The owner is a godsmarked, too. I haven't been in a while, but last I was there was also another marked who was working there. The owner has a standing policy to hire any marked that needs a job, she added as explanation. I found that, as someone who is also an outsider of sorts to the area, there's a bit of a shared plight and kinship to be shared. Xander was shocked and elated to hear about the existence of other godsmarked nearby. I had no idea there were any godsmarked in the city at all. Well, it's a big city, Valteria said. There's usually at least a few in any large city. You just have to look hard enough. Huh. I suppose that makes sense. I just never thought about it. Now, I believe you mentioned something called photos? How exactly is something like a painting without being a painting? Xander scooted his stool closer to Valteria and pulled his phone into his hand from his inventory. He spent the next few hours with Valteria, shouldered up to him, peering at his phone as he went through pictures in his gallery. As they went through the photos, he absent-mindedly scratched Freya's head, as the cat had come back over to them. Valteria, for her part, bombarded him with questions about anything that caught her eye. He found himself trying to roughly explain how a car worked, which led into a rabbit hole about internal combustion engines and how they'd started as steam engines, before trying to explain how skyscrapers could be so tall without falling over, along with a great many other things that he was only vaguely able to explain. The time flew by for Xander as he found himself enjoying talking with the woman next to him, who kept constantly going off onto new tangents of her own when he would explain something, trying to relate it to her own work and fitting new ideas into things. Jarrett handled the customers that came in, indulging Valteria in his own way as she pored over Xander's photos. Xander and Valteria's conversational trance was finally broken as Valteria paused to stretch her neck out, causing a few pops to crackle out as she did so. Xander stared at her jealously. "What?" she asked, confused. "You have no idea how jealous I am that you can still pop your joints. I had no idea how much I missed being able to do that until this exact moment. Valteria laughed and brought her fingers up and began to pop those joints as well. That is a tragedy. I suppose I'll just have to make up for your lack of... She stopped, struggling to find a word. Popability? You are literally torturing me right now, Xander lamented. Well, if you'd held that phone thing of yours at an easier angle, I wouldn't be so stiff, she said in a mockingly haughty voice. Looking around, her eyes alighted on one of the clocks in the room. Oh, damnation, we really did talk the day away, didn't we? It's about time to close up shop. She turned to Jarrett and said, Thank you for handling all the customers today, Jarrett. I hope it didn't interrupt your own work too much. Oh, no, Miss Valteria, it's all fine, the man replied. I just couldn't bring myself to interrupt you two. You were so excited about whatever it was that you were looking at. It is greatly appreciated all the same, she said. And don't worry about cleaning up today, I'll handle it. Perhaps I'll press Xander into service and have him sweep for me since he so graciously kept me from doing any work. It certainly was not any of own doing. Xander looked between the two of them and shrugged his shoulders helplessly. I can bring Freyja to this tavern, right? He asked Valteria, choosing to ignore the threat of sweeping. Jarrett made his way out of the shop as the two were speaking, leaving them to their own devices. I don't see why not. Charles, that's the owner's name, by the way, always says he's a big animal lover. So I say we put it to the test. Besides, Freya is quite well behaved. Valteria cautiously reached out to stroke the top of the large cat's head, pleased that 1, her hand wasn't bitten off, and 2, Freya rubbed her head against the hand petting her. All righty, if you think it won't be a problem, I can always tell him she's my emotional support animal, he joked. If you love engaging stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all the latest episodes from FY Stories.